Genesis. Genesis is the first book of the Old Testament and the foundation of the Bible. Its name means beginnings. It is divided into two main parts. The first, chapters 1 to 11, covers creation, the fall, the flood, and the Tower of Babel, events that explain the origins of the world, humanity, sin, and God's covenant. The second part, chapters 12 to 50, focuses on the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Through them, God establishes a chosen people, promising Abraham descendants, land, and blessing for all nations. Genesis introduces central themes like God as creator, humanity's sin and need for redemption, and God's faithfulness to his promises. Exodus. Exodus records God's deliverance of Israel from slavery in Egypt and the formation of Israel as a covenant nation. The first part, chapters 1 to 18, tells how God raised up Moses, unleashed the 10 plagues against Egypt, and led the people out through the Red Sea. The second part, chapters 19 to 40, describes Israel at Mount Sinai, where God gave the 10 commandments, established laws, and instructed the building of the tabernacle. Central themes include God's power to save, his covenant relationship with his people, and his presence dwelling among them. Exodus is the story of redemption and the foundation of Israel's identity as God's chosen nation. Leviticus. Leviticus focuses on the laws and rituals that shaped Israel's worship and daily life. It explains how sinful people can live in the presence of a holy God. The book is structured around offerings, priestly duties, and laws for purity. Key sections include instructions for sacrifices, chapters 1 to 7, the consecration of priests, chapters 8 to 10, laws about clean and unclean things, chapters 11 to 15, the Day of Atonement, chapter 16, and guidelines for holy living, chapters 17 to 27. Its central theme is holiness. Be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. Leviticus 19:2. Leviticus shows that forgiveness, worship, and fellowship with God require sacrifice and obedience. Numbers continues Israel's journey from Mount Sinai toward the Promised Land. Its name comes from the censuses of the people taken at the beginning and near the end of the book. The narrative includes Israel's organization into tribes, their wanderings in the wilderness, and repeated failures to trust God, such as their refusal to enter Canaan after the spies' report in chapter 13. As a result, the older generation was condemned to die in the wilderness, and a new generation was prepared to take their place. Despite rebellion and judgment, God remained faithful, guiding them with his presence and providing for their needs. The book emphasizes God's holiness, human weakness, and the necessity of trust and obedience. Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, meaning second law, is Moses' series of farewell speeches to Israel before they enter the Promised Land. It repeats and expands the law given at Sinai, applying it to the new generation. The book reviews Israel's journey, restates the 10 Commandments, and emphasizes wholehearted love and obedience to God. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. All your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. Deuteronomy 6:5. It warns against idolatry and outlines blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. Deuteronomy closes with Moses' song, Blessing of the Tribes, and death. The book highlights covenant loyalty, calling Israel to choose life by obeying God's word. Joshua. The book of Joshua recounts Israel's entry into the Promised Land under Joshua's leadership after Moses' death. The first half, chapters 1 to 12, describes the conquest of Canaan, including the crossing of the Jordan River, the fall of Jericho, and key battles against Canaanite kings. The second half, chapters 13 to 24, details the division of the land among the tribes and Joshua's farewell address. Central themes include God's faithfulness to his promises, the necessity of courage and obedience, and the complete devotion required to follow the Lord. Joshua presents the fulfillment of God's covenant promise to Abraham as Israel takes possession of the land sworn to their ancestors. Judges. The book of Judges covers the time between Joshua's leadership and the rise of Israel's monarchy. It describes a recurring cycle. Israel falls into sin and idolatry. God allows enemies to oppress them. The people cry out for help, and God raises up a judge to deliver them. Notable judges include Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson. Each story highlights both God's mercy and Israel's repeated unfaithfulness. The book ends with the statement, "In those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit." Judges 21:25. Judges emphasizes the consequences of disobedience and the need for godly leadership, showing Israel's drift without centralized guidance. Ruth. The book of Ruth is a short narrative set during the time of the Judges. It tells the story of Ruth, a Moabite widow who remains loyal to her Israelite mother-in-law, Naomi. Ruth's faithfulness leads her to Bethlehem, where she meets Boaz, a relative of Naomi, who acts as a kinsman redeemer by marrying her. Their son, Obed, becomes the grandfather of King David. Themes of loyalty, redemption, and God's providence run throughout the book. Ruth demonstrates that God's covenant blessings extend beyond Israel to include Gentiles, and that ordinary faithfulness can play a key role in God's larger plan of salvation. 1 Samuel. First, Samuel marks the transition of Israel from the time of Judges to the establishment of monarchy. It begins with the story of Samuel's birth and his role as prophet, priest, and judge. The book recounts Israel's demand for a king, leading to Saul's anointing as the first king. Saul's reign is marked by initial success, but eventual disobedience, resulting in God rejecting him. David is then anointed as Saul's successor, and his rise begins with the famous defeat of Goliath. The rest of the book contrasts Saul's decline with David's growing favor with God and the people. Key themes include God's sovereignty in choosing leaders, the importance of obedience over sacrifice, and the rise of Davidic kingship. 2 Samuel. 2. Samuel focuses on the reign of David as king over Israel. After Saul's death, David is anointed king, first over Judah and then over all Israel. The book highlights his military victories, the establishment of Jerusalem as the capital, and the bringing of the Ark of the Covenant into the city. Central to the book is God's covenant with David in chapter 7, promising that his throne would be established forever. Yet 2 Samuel also records David's failures, including his sin with Bathsheba and the rebellion of his son Absalom. The narrative shows both the strength and flaws of David's kingship, emphasizing God's faithfulness and mercy, even when his chosen king falls short. 1 Kings. 1 Kings continues the history of Israel, beginning with Solomon's reign. It describes Solomon's wisdom, wealth, and the building of the temple in Jerusalem. However, his later years are marked by idolatry, leading to division after his death. The kingdom splits into the northern kingdom, Israel, and the southern kingdom, Judah. The rest of the book alternates between the kings of both nations, evaluating them by their faithfulness to God. Prophets such as Elijah confront corruption and idolatry, especially under King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. Key themes include the importance of covenant faithfulness, the dangers of idolatry, and God's use of prophets to call his people back to obedience. 2 Kings. 2 Kings continues the account of the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah. It records the ministries of prophets like Elisha, who performed miracles and called rulers and people back to God. The northern kingdom of Israel repeatedly turned to idolatry and was eventually conquered by Assyria in 722 BC, fulfilling the prophet's warnings. The southern kingdom of Judah lasted longer, but also fell into corruption, leading to its destruction by Babylon in 586 BC and the exile of its people. The book emphasizes that both judgment and hope come from God, judgment for persistent sin, and hope through God's promises that the story of his people would not end in exile. 1 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles retells Israel's history with a focus on David's reign. It begins with extensive genealogies that trace God's people from Adam to the tribes of Israel, emphasizing continuity and God's covenant purposes. The narrative then highlights David's military victories, his preparations for the temple, and his organization of priests, Levites, musicians, and gatekeepers for worship. Unlike 1 to 2 Samuel, the book does not dwell on David's failures but portrays him as the ideal king whose heart was devoted to God. The central theme is worship, God's presence among his people, and the proper order of temple service. 1 Chronicles encourages post-exilic Israel to see themselves as heirs of God's promises through David and the temple. 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles continues the focus on the southern kingdom of Judah, beginning with Solomon's reign. It describes the building and dedication of the temple, emphasizing God's presence and the importance of true worship. The book then traces the line of kings in Judah, highlighting their faithfulness or unfaithfulness to God. Unlike Kings, it largely omits the history of the northern kingdom of Israel. Prophets like Azariah and Zechariah appear to call Judah back to covenant obedience. The narrative concludes with the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon in 586 BC, but it ends on a note of hope with Cyrus of Persia allowing the exiles to return and rebuild the temple. The central theme is that blessing follows obedience, while disobedience brings judgment, and yet God's mercy provides restoration. Ezra records the return of the Jewish exiles from Babylon and the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. The first part, chapters 1 to 6, describes how Cyrus of Persia issued a decree allowing the exiles to return and how they laid the temple's foundation, though the work faced opposition and delays. The second part, chapters 7 to 10, introduces Ezra, a priest and scribe, who leads a later group back to Jerusalem. Ezra emphasizes the importance of God's law, the purity of worship, and separation from foreign practices that threatened Israel's covenant identity. The book highlights God's faithfulness in restoring his people and the necessity of obedience to his word as the foundation of renewal. Nehemiah continues the story of Israel's restoration after the exile. As cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes, Nehemiah learned of Jerusalem's broken walls and prayed for God's help. Granted permission, he returned to Jerusalem and led the rebuilding of the city's defenses despite opposition from surrounding enemies. Alongside Ezra, he helped renew the people's commitment to God's law through public reading and covenant renewal. The book highlights Nehemiah's leadership, perseverance in the face of opposition, and reliance on prayer. It emphasizes that true restoration involves both physical rebuilding and spiritual renewal, showing how God's people must remain faithful to his covenant even after returning from exile. Esther. The book of Esther tells the story of a Jewish woman who becomes queen of Persia and, through courage, saves her people from destruction. When the king's advisor Haman plots to annihilate the Jews, Esther's cousin Mordecai urges her to intervene, even at the risk of her life. Esther bravely reveals her Jewish identity to the king, exposes Haman's scheme, and secures a royal decree allowing the Jews to defend themselves. A key feature of the book is that God is never mentioned by name, yet his providence is evident throughout, in Esther's rise to queen, in the timing of events, and in the reversal of Haman's plot. The book establishes the festival of Purim to celebrate God's deliverance, reminding readers of his unseen but powerful hand in protecting his people. Job. The book of Job explores the problem of suffering and the sovereignty of God. Job is described as a righteous man who loses his wealth, children, and health in a sudden series of disasters allowed by God, but initiated by Satan's challenge. Most of the book consists of poetic dialogues between Job and his friends, who argue that his suffering must be punishment for sin. Job insists on his innocence and pleads for understanding. Eventually, God speaks from a whirlwind, questioning Job and revealing the vastness of divine wisdom compared to human understanding. Job repents in humility, and God restores his fortunes. The central theme is that suffering is not always the result of sin, and God's purposes go beyond human comprehension. Psalms. The Book of Psalms is a collection of 150 songs, prayers, and poems written by various authors, including David, Asaph, the sons of Korah, Solomon, and others. The Psalms express the full range of human experience: praise, thanksgiving, lament, confession, wisdom, and trust in God. They were used in Israel's worship and remain central to Jewish and Christian prayer. Key themes include God's kingship, his covenant faithfulness, the hope of a coming Messiah, and the assurance that God hears his people in every circumstance. The Psalms teach believers how to pray honestly, worship deeply, and anchor their lives in God's character. Proverbs. The book of Proverbs is a collection of wise sayings, primarily attributed to Solomon, though other contributors include Agur and King Lemuel. Its purpose is to teach wisdom, practical skill in living according to God's ways. The book is structured as short, memorable statements that contrast wisdom and folly, righteousness and wickedness, diligence and laziness. Key themes include the fear of the Lord as the foundation of wisdom, Proverbs 1:7, the importance of humility, the power of words, and the value of discipline. Proverbs emphasizes that wise choices lead to life and blessing, while foolishness leads to ruin. It serves as a guide for moral and spiritual formation in everyday life. Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes, traditionally attributed to Solomon and written under the title The Teacher or Koheleth, reflects on the meaning of life. The repeated phrase, vanity of vanities, all is vanity, captures the theme. Life under the sun, pursuits like wealth, pleasure, work, and wisdom cannot provide ultimate fulfillment. The book wrestles with life's brevity, injustice, and uncertainty, acknowledging both the value of wisdom and its limitations. Yet it concludes that the true purpose of life is to fear God and keep His commandments. Ecclesiastes 12:13. Ecclesiastes is a sobering meditation on the emptiness of life without God, and a call to live in reverence and obedience to Him. Song of Songs. The Song of Songs, also known as the Song of Solomon, is a collection of lyrical poems celebrating love between a bride and groom. Written in highly poetic language, it portrays the beauty of romantic desire, marital intimacy, and mutual devotion. Jewish tradition often interprets it as an allegory of God's love for Israel, while Christian interpreters have seen it as a picture of Christ's love for the church. At the same time, it affirms human love and marriage as gifts from God. The book highlights love's power, exclusivity, and permanence. Many waters cannot quench love, rivers cannot sweep it away. Song of Songs 8:7. Isaiah. The book of Isaiah is one of the major prophetic books, spanning 66 chapters. It addresses both judgment and hope. The first part, chapters 1 to 39, contains warnings of judgment against Judah and the nations for their sin, while also offering glimpses of a coming Messiah and future restoration. The second part, chapters 40 to 66, shifts to comfort, proclaiming God's sovereignty, the promise of redemption, and the vision of a new heaven and new earth. Key passages include Isaiah's call in chapter 6, the prophecy of the virgin birth in 7:14, the description of the suffering servant in chapter 53, and the announcement of God's everlasting kingdom. Isaiah's central message is that salvation comes from the Lord alone, who will accomplish it through His chosen servant and king. Jeremiah. The book of Jeremiah records the ministry of the prophet Jeremiah, who served during the final decades of Judah before the Babylonian exile. His message combined warnings of coming judgment with calls to repentance. Despite opposition and persecution, Jeremiah proclaimed that Jerusalem would fall because of the people's persistent idolatry and injustice. He also delivered promises of hope, including the prophecy of a new covenant written on the heart, Jeremiah 31:31-34. The book contains both poetic oracles and historical narratives, including Jeremiah's own struggles and laments. Central themes include God's holiness, the certainty of judgment for unrepented sin, and the assurance of restoration through God's covenant faithfulness. Lamentations. Lamentations is a collection of 5 poems mourning the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. Traditionally attributed to Jeremiah, the book expresses grief over the city's devastation, the suffering of its people, and the loss of the temple. The poems are carefully structured, with much of the book written in acrostic form, where each verse begins with a successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Despite its tone of sorrow, Lamentations also affirms God's faithfulness. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for His compassions never fail. Lamentations 3:22. The book teaches how to bring grief and pain honestly before God, acknowledging both the reality of judgment and the hope of His mercy. Ezekiel. The book of Ezekiel records the visions and prophecies of Ezekiel, a priest taken into exile in Babylon. The first part, chapters 1 to 24, focuses on God's judgment against Judah, using vivid imagery such as the vision of God's glory on the throne and symbolic acts demonstrating coming destruction. The next section, chapters 25 to 32, contains oracles against foreign nations. The final section, chapters 33 to 48, shifts to messages of hope and restoration, including the vision of the Valley of Dry Bones, symbolizing Israel's renewal, and a detailed vision of a future temple. Ezekiel emphasizes God's holiness, His presence even in exile, and His power to bring life where there is death.